The air inside the old stone estate was thick with the scent of aging wood and a faint, sweet smell of beeswax polish. It was a world away from the sterile, recycled air of the office tower, where the CEO usually spent his days. Sunlight, the color of warm honey, streamed through tall, arched windows, illuminating millions of tiny dust motes that danced like silent, chaotic fairies in the golden beams. In the center of the grand lounge, a massive fireplace crackled and popped, its flames licking at the logs and casting a flickering warm glow on the faces of the people gathered nearby. This was the company offsite, carefully planned exercise in team building and corporate synergy. Designed to break down the invisible walls that separated the executives from the rest of the staff, for most, it was a welcome break. For him, it was just another stage. He stood near the hearth, a glass of untouched, sparkling water in his hand. His suit jacket was off, but his posture remained as sharp and unyielding as a folded letter. He was a man who had built an empire from nothing but grit and a mind that saw the world in numbers and patterns. His face, often described in business profiles as chiseled and determined, was a mask of polite, focused attention. He nodded as his head of marketing spoke about third-quarter projections, his eyes occasionally darting around the room, not out of boredom but out of habit. He was always analyzing, always processing. He saw the clusters of employees, the subtle power dynamics at play, the way the junior staff nervously held their drinks a little too tight. He was the puppet master, and this was his theater. Even when he was supposed to be relaxing, to his team, he was an enigma. Brilliant, driven, and utterly impenetrable. They had stories about him, legends passed down in hushed tones by the water cooler, how he could recall a specific data point from a report 3 years old, how he worked 16-hour days and never seemed to tire, how he had turned down a lucrative buyout offer with a simple, "We're not finished yet." But no one had a story about him laughing, or crying, or talking about anything that wasn't directly related to the business. He was a fortress, and the drawbridge was permanently up, in a quiet corner of the room, away from the buzzing circles of conversation, sat the reason for the estate's charm: a beautiful, grand mahogany piano. It was a magnificent instrument, its dark, polished wood reflecting the room like a deep, still lake. The ivory keys had a slight yellowing to them, a sign of age and use, and it looked as though it hadn't been played in years, yet it seemed to hum with a silent, waiting energy. It was a relic from a different time, a time of art and passion, things that had no place on a balance sheet. A young woman, an intern from the design department whose name tag read Chloe, had been quietly observing the piano for several minutes. She was new, fresh out of college, and hadn't yet learned the unwritten rules of corporate engagement, like not approaching the CEO unless spoken to. She saw the world not in patterns and numbers, but in colors, textures, and feelings. To her, the piano wasn't just an old piece of furniture. It was a story waiting to be told. She imagined the hands that had played it, the music that had filled this room, the celebrations and quiet moments it had witnessed, driven by a simple, genuine curiosity that overshadowed any corporate anxiety. Chloe drifted away from the small group she was with. She moved through the room with a light, almost unconscious grace, her eyes fixed on the piano. She ran a finger gently along its smooth, curved side, a small smile touching her lips. She was completely lost in her admiration. A world away from the talk of market share and revenue streams, her path naturally took her closer to the fireplace, closer to the small, intense circle of senior executives. As she passed by, she overheard a snippet of their conversation about algorithm optimization. It sounded like a different language to her. Her gaze shifted from the piano to the man at the center of the group, the one everyone called the CEO. She recognized him from his picture on the company website. But in person, he seemed both more powerful and more guarded. He looked like a statue carved from ice, except for his eyes, which held a deep, blessing wariness. On an impulse, she stopped. The question that popped into her head was innocent, a simple, social pleasantry one might offer at any party. She didn't see the CEO, the titan of industry. She just saw a man standing near a beautiful piano. "That piano is absolutely gorgeous," she said, her voice clear and soft, cutting through the low hum of corporate talk. A few of the executives turned, slightly annoyed by the interruption. The CEO himself didn't react at first, his focus still on the marketing director. Chloe, undeterred and completely unaware of the social line she was crossing, looked directly at him and asked with a bright, friendly smile, "Does anyone here play?" "Can you, Mr. Croft?" The question landed in the middle of their huddle like a stone dropped into a still pond. The casual chatter died instantly. The marketing director's voice trailed off mid-sentence. All eyes turned from the intern to the CEO. For a fraction of a second, nothing happened. Then, a change. It was almost imperceptible, a flicker so quick that anyone who didn't know him might have missed it. The carefully constructed mask of composure on his face seemed to crack, just for a moment. His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly, and the light in his eyes shifted from analytical focus to something else, something distant and pained. The glass of water in his hand trembled, a tiny shiver that ran up his arm. It wasn't just a question. It was a key, turning in a lock he had welded shut years ago. The name of his wife, a concert pianist, echoed silently in his mind. The sound of her laughter, the scent of her perfume, the feel of her hand and hizzle of it came rushing back in a single, crushing wave, triggered by 5 simple words from a girl who was just trying to be nice. He felt a sudden sharp pain in his chest, a phantom limb ache for a life that was long gone. The room, the people, the fire, it all faded into a blurry background. All he could see was the piano, and all he could hear was the ghost of a melody. The silence that followed the intern's question was a strange, heavy thing. It wasn't an empty silence. It was packed with unspoken words and a sudden, sharp curiosity from everyone in the room. The low hum of the air conditioning, the distant clatter of dishes from the kitchen, the crackle of the fire, it all seemed to fade into a dull, muffled background. For the CEO, the world had shrunk to the space between him and the young woman, and the large, imposing piece of furniture that stood between them like a judge. His mind, usually a fortress of logic and order, was suddenly in chaos. It was like a computer that had been hit with a power surge, all the systems crashing at once. He tried to access his usual defenses, the polite deflection, the charming but firm change of subject, but they were gone. The circuits were fried. All he could do was stand there, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird desperate to escape. He could feel a thin sheen of cold sweat on his forehead, and the glass of water in his hand suddenly felt incredibly heavy. A leaden weight he couldn't drop. He forced himself to look away from the intern's bright, expectant face. Her eyes were wide and innocent, full of nothing more than simple curiosity. She had no idea that she had just taken a sledgehammer to the thickest wall of his soul. His gaze drifted past her, landing on the piano. It was no longer just a beautiful object in a beautiful room. It was a monster. It was a ghost. It was a door to a place he had sworn he would never visit again, and then he saw it near the foot pedals. There was a small, faded scratch. It was shaped like a tiny, sideways crescent moon, almost invisible unless you were looking for it. But he was looking for it. Or rather, his memory was... He saw it as clearly as if it had been made yesterday. He remembered the day it happened. They were moving the piano into their first apartment together, a small, sunny place with squeaky floorboards. She was guiding it, laughing as he struggled with its weight on the other side. Her foot slipped, and the edge of her shoe scuffed the polished wood. She had been so upset, her face falling as she traced the mark with her finger. "It's ruined," she had whispered, her eyes filling with tears. He had just laughed, pulling her into a hug and kissing the top of her head. "It's not ruined," he had said. "It's our first mark. It makes it ours." A hot, sharp pain lanced through his chest. It couldn't be. It was impossible. He had sold that piano. He remembered the day clearly, a bleak, gray Tuesday, a year after she was gone. 2 men from a second-hand shop had come to the house. He had watched them wrap it in thick blankets, their movements careful and impersonal. He had handed them the keys and the signed papers, and when they drove away, he had felt nothing, or at least that's what he told himself. He had sold it, along with her clothes, her books, her sheet music. He had sold every single thing that reminded him of her, hoping that if he erased the physical evidence, the memories would fade too. He had been wrong. They had just gone dormant, waiting for a trigger. This had to be a coincidence. There were thousands of grand pianos in the world. Millions, even. Some of them probably had a similar scratch. He tried to tell himself this, to logic his way out of the feeling of dread that was washing over him in cold waves. But a deeper, more instinctual part of him knew. It was the same way he knew a market trend was about to shift, a gut feeling that his spreadsheets couldn't yet quantify. This was his life, and this was that piano. He had to get out of there. He had to leave this room, this estate, this whole stupid offsite. He could feel a panic attack rising in his throat, a tight, choking feeling. He took a slow, deep breath, the kind he practiced before high-stakes board meetings. He could do this. He was in control. He was always in control. He finally managed to paste a smile on his face. It felt brittle, like it might crack at any moment. He looked at the intern, hoping his voice sounded normal. "I'm afraid my talents lie in spreadsheets, not sonatas," he said, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. It was a good line. It was the kind of charming, self-deprecating thing a CEO was supposed to say. It should have worked. It should have ended the conversation and allowed everyone to move on. But the intern, bless her innocent heart, just smiled wider. "Oh, come on, just one song," she said, her tone light and encouraging. "It would be so amazing to hear it played in this room. It feels like it's been waiting forever." Someone else from the group, a young guy from the sales team, chimed in. "Yeah, boss, don't be shy," he said with a laugh. A few others joined in, a chorus of gentle, good-natured encouragement. They saw it as a rare opportunity, a chance to see their stoic, mysterious leader in a different light. They thought they were being friendly, breaking down barriers. They had no idea they were pushing him toward a cliff's edge. He was trapped. He couldn't just walk away now. That would be rude, strange. It would create a scene, the very thing he had spent his entire life avoiding. He looked around at their faces, all turned toward him, a sea of hopeful, unknowing eyes. There was no escape. He was a cornered animal, and the only way out was through. He felt a strange, invisible force pulling him forward. It wasn't a choice. It was a compulsion. His feet began to move, seemingly of their own accord, carrying him across the thick, patterned rug. Each step felt like he was walking through cement. The room seemed to stretch, the distance between the fireplace and the piano growing with every beat of his heart. He could feel everyone's eyes on his back, a physical weight pressing down on his shoulders. He reached the piano and stopped. It was even more imposing up close. He could see the intricate grain of the mahogany, the delicate filigree on the legs, the faint reflection of his own pale, strained face in the polished wood. He slowly reached out a hand, his fingers trembling slightly. He didn't touch it, not yet. He just let his hand hover over the smooth, cool surface, a fraction of an inch away. He was afraid to touch it, afraid that the contact would send an electric shock of memory through him, one that he might not survive. The air around his hand seemed to crackle with energy, with the ghost of her touch, the echo of her music. He was standing at the edge of the precipice, looking down into a past he had tried so hard to bury. He finally let his hand drop, his fingers making contact with the cool, smooth ivory of the keys. A jolt, like a static shock, shot up his arm. It wasn't an electric shock, but a memory shock. He could feel the phantom warmth of her hand covering his, guiding his own clumsy fingers to the correct notes all those years ago. "Feel the music. Don't just think it," she used to whisper, her breath tickling his ear. He had been a logical man even then, trying to understand music as a series of mathematical progressions. She had been trying to teach him to feel it, to let it live inside him. Slowly, as if his joints had rusted shut. He lowered himself onto the polished wooden bench. It let out a soft creak of protest, a loud sound in the now silent room. The bench was hard and unyielding beneath him. From this new lower angle, the room looked different. The faces of his employees were above him, like a jury peering down. The fireplace seemed taller, its flames reaching higher. but his world had shrunk to the 88 black and white keys in front of him. They were a universe, a language he had once been fluent in, but had since forgotten. He placed his right hand on the keys, his fingers finding the familiar starting position. His left hand followed, resting lightly on the lower register. He could feel the faint vibration of the room's silence through the wood, a low, expectant hum. He took a deep breath, the air catching in his throat. He had no idea what he was going to play. His mind was a blank slate, wiped clean by the sheer force of the moment. He just sat there, his hands poised, a statue of a man about to break. Then, his fingers moved. The first note was a mistake. It was clumsy, too loud, a jarring C-sharp that hung in the air like a cry for help. A few people in the room flinched. He felt a hot flush of embarrassment. This was a terrible idea. He should just get up, apologize, and walk away. But his fingers didn't listen. They moved again, this time finding the correct note, a soft, gentle B-flat. It was hesitant, questioning. Another note followed, and then another. They weren't forming a song yet, just a series of disconnected searching sounds. Like a person waking up in a dark room and fumbling for a light switch, and then they found it. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a reflex. A deep, buried muscle memory took over, and his fingers began to move with a purpose they hadn't known in a decade. The first few bars of Clair de Lune emerged slowly, tentatively, like a flower pushing its way through frozen ground. The melody was simple, haunting, and achingly beautiful. It was her favorite piece. The one she played on rainy Sunday afternoons, the one that made the whole world feel quiet and sad and peaceful all at once. As the melody began to take shape, something shifted inside him. The tight, panicked feeling in his chest started to loosen, replaced by a different kind of ache. It was a deep, resonant sorrow, but it wasn't unbearable. It was familiar. It was the feeling of coming home to a place that was no longer there. He was no longer the CEO sitting at a piano. He was a young man again, sitting on the couch in their small apartment, watching her play, completely mesmerized. He could almost smell the rain on the window pane and the scent of the coffee she had brewed. His fingers grew more confident. The music began to flow more freely, the hesitant notes giving way to a smoother, more connected phrase. He wasn't thinking about the notes anymore. He wasn't thinking at all. His hands knew the way. They remembered the path she had taught them, the way the melody arched and fell like a wave. His eyes closed, shutting out the room, the people, the present. He was floating in a sea of sound, and the currents were pulling him back in time. He saw her face. Not as a blurry, distant memory, but as clear as if she were sitting right next to him. He saw the way a single stray curl would fall across her forehead when she was deeply focused on the music. He saw the small, satisfied smile that would play on her lips when she nailed a difficult passage. He saw her turn to him, her eyes shining, and say, "Listen to this part. It's like the moon is talking directly to your heart." The music swelled, moving into the more complex, passionate middle section. His left hand, which had been quiet, now came alive, adding a depth and richness to the melody. The chords were fuller, more emotional. This was the part of the music that always made her cry. He remembered asking her why, if it was so beautiful, it made her sad. "It's not sad," she had explained, wiping a tear from her cheek. "It's just so full of feeling. It's like it holds all the beauty and all the pain in the world, all at once. It's everything." And that's what he was playing now. He was pouring all of it into the piano. 10 years of grief, 10 years of loneliness, 10 years of building a fortress around his heart. He was playing the sleepless nights, the empty side of the bed, the moments of sudden, shocking memory when he'd see a woman on the street who looked like her from behind. He was playing the anger he felt at the world for taking her, the guilt he felt for moving on, the profound, unending love that he still carried for her like a heavy, precious stone in his pocket. The people in the room had completely forgotten he was their boss. They had forgotten about the company, the offsite, the awkwardness of the moment. They were just witnessing something incredibly private, something they weren't meant to see. The intern who had asked the question was standing with her hand over her mouth. her eyes wide with a dawning, horrified understanding. The head of marketing had his arms crossed, his usual smug expression replaced by one of soft, reverent awe. They were no longer a group of employees and a CEO. They were a congregation. And he was in the middle of a sermon, a prayer, a confession. The music began to soften again, moving back toward the gentle, melancholic theme of the beginning. The notes were sparser now, each one hanging in the air with a new weight, a new meaning. They were like quiet goodbyes. He could feel the tears welling up behind his closed eyelids, but he didn't fight them. He let them come. He was no longer in control. The music was, the memory was, the love was. His fingers played the final sorrowful chords. The last note was soft, a single, delicate sound that seemed to hold all the silence in the world. He let it ring out, letting it fade into nothingness. And then there was only silence. A profound, absolute silence that was heavier and more meaningful than any sound. His fingers remained on the keys, his head still bowed. He was breathing heavily, his shoulders slumped as if he had just run a marathon. In a way, he had. He had just run through 10 years of his life in the space of a few minutes, and he was exhausted. The final, sorrowful chord of Clair de Lune dissolved into the air, but the sound didn't just disappear. It seemed to sink into the wood panels, the plush rugs, and the very bones of the people standing in the room. The silence that followed was not a normal silence. It was a heavy, sacred thing, thick with the ghosts of the melody and the raw emotion that had just been poured into it. It was the kind of quiet that falls in a cathedral after a powerful hymn, a space filled with unspoken prayers and collective awe. No one dared to breathe too loudly, afraid of shattering the fragile atmosphere. For the CEO, the world had ceased to exist. There was only the lingering vibration of the strings beneath his fingers and the roaring in his ears. His hands remained frozen on the keys, his head still bowed, his body curled over the piano as if in prayer. He was a man who had just run a marathon through his own past, and he had nothing left. The fortress he had spent 10 years building, brick by painful brick, had just been leveled by a single piece of music. The walls were gone, the defenses were obliterated, and all that was left was the raw, wounded man inside. It started with a tremor, a small, almost imperceptible shudder that ran through his shoulders. It was like the first warning sign of an earthquake, a deep rumbling from within his very core. His fingers, which had moved with such grace and memory moments before, now felt stiff and foreign on the ivory keys. He slowly, painfully pulled them away and brought his hands to his face. It was a gesture of surrender, of a man who could no longer face the world. And then, the dam broke. A sound tore from his throat, a choked, guttural sob that was so full of pain it seemed to physically hurt the people who heard it. It wasn't the sound of a man crying. It was the sound of a soul breaking. It was the sound of 10 years of unshed tears, of grief swallowed and buried under work and logic and a carefully constructed indifference. It was the sound of a love so profound that its loss had left a void in his chest that he had tried, failed, to fill with everything else. His whole body began to shake. His shoulders heaved with the force of the sobs that racked his frame. He slumped forward, his forehead resting on the cool wood of the piano, his face hidden in his hands. The powerful, unshakable CEO, the man who commanded boardrooms and dictated market trends, was completely, utterly broken. He was no longer a leader or an executive. He was just a man who had lost the other half of his soul. And for the first time in a decade, he was allowing himself to feel the full, crushing weight of that loss. The employees stood frozen, a silent audience to a tragedy they hadn't known they were attending. The young guy from the sales team, who had moments before been cheerfully egging him on, now stared down at his shoes, his face burning with a mixture of shame and shock. The head of marketing, a man whose entire persona was built on control and confidence, looked utterly lost, his arms hanging limply at his sides. They had no playbook for this. There was no corporate protocol for what to do. When your boss shatters into a million pieces in front of you, the intern, who had started it all, felt a cold dread wash over her. She saw his shaking shoulders and heard his ragged, painful sobs, and all she could think was, I did that. Her innocent, simple question had been a key, and she had unlocked a room full of ghosts. She wanted to run, to hide, to turn back time and keep her mouth shut. She had seen him as a figure of authority, an untouchable icon, and now she saw him as a human being in agony, a pain she had accidentally, unknowingly caused. Her eyes filled with tears of her own, tears of guilt, and a profound, heartbreaking empathy. The minutes stretched, each one feeling like an eternity. The silence was no longer sacred. It was now thick with an unbearable awkwardness. Should someone say something? Should someone leave? Should someone go to him? No one moved. They were trapped by a social etiquette that had never been designed to handle such a raw, unfiltered display of emotion from a person in a position of power. The invisible wall between the executive suite and the rest of the company had not just been lowered. It had been completely demolished, leaving everyone standing in the rubble.
Oh.
Unsure of where to go or what to do next. The power dynamic in the room had undergone a seismic shift. He was no longer the CEO, and they were no longer his employees. In that moment, they were just a group of people who had witnessed another person's deepest, most private vulnerability. The titles, the salaries, the hierarchies, it all meant nothing in the face of such profound human sorrow. He was at his lowest point, and in doing so, he had brought them all down to the same level, the level of simple, shared humanity. His tears were not just for her. They were for the lonely dinners, the empty holidays, the moments of crushing silence in a house that was too big for one person. They were for the phone calls he wanted to make but couldn't, for the stories he had no one to tell. They were for the man he used to be, a man who could laugh freely and love without fear of losing it all. He was crying for a decade of his life that he had spent sleepwalking, pretending he was okay when he was anything but. Each sob was a release, a letting go of a piece of the weight he had been carrying for so long, as the initial violent storm of his grief began to subside. His sobs softened into quiet, ragged hiccups. His body still trembled, but the convulsive shuddering had eased. He was left exhausted, hollowed out, like a tree that had been struck by lightning. He slowly lifted his head from the piano, his face a mess of tears and blotchy red skin. He didn't look at anyone. He just stared at his hands, resting limply in his lap, as if they belonged to someone else. He was a shipwrecked man, washed ashore after a decade at sea, and he had no idea what land he had arrived on. The breaking point had passed, but now came the terrifying, uncertain aftermath. The silence that followed his breakdown was a different kind of quiet. It was no longer the sacred, reverent hush that had followed the music, nor was it the frozen, awkward silence of his initial collapse. This new silence was softer, more breathable. It was the quiet of a room full of people holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. The CEO sat slumped on the piano bench, a man adrift in the wreckage of his own emotions. His face was a mess, his eyes puffy and red, his shirt collar damp with tears. He felt hollowed out, like a shell washed clean by a violent tide, leaving behind nothing but the smooth, achingly empty surface. He slowly lifted his head, his gaze still unfocused. He looked at his hands resting in his lap, not recognizing them as the same hands that had just commanded the keys with such passion. They felt weak, foreign. He was aware of the people in the room, but they were just blurry shapes at the edge of his vision. He was trapped inside his own head, replaying the memories that the music had unleashed. Feeling the raw, open wound of his grief, he had no idea what to do next. The thought of standing up, of facing them, of trying to be the CEO again, was overwhelming. He was exposed, stripped of every layer of protection he had so carefully constructed. Then, a movement cut through the stillness. It was the director of operations. A woman in her late 50s, with kind eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor. She was known for her efficiency and her practicality. The person who could solve any logistical problem the company threw at her. But as she moved slowly across the room, there was nothing practical about her approach. It was gentle, deliberate, and filled with a quiet grace that no one in the office had ever seen from her. The other employees watched her, their own uncertainty mirrored in their faces. What was she going to do? She didn't rush to his side. She walked to the small table against the wall, poured a glass of water from a crystal pitcher, and then approached the piano. She didn't say a word. She simply stood beside him for a moment, a quiet, solid presence. Then she leaned down and placed the cool glass on the polished wood of the piano within his easy reach. It was a simple act, but it was everything. It wasn't pity. It wasn't an intrusion. It was an offering of basic human kindness. She remained standing there, her hands clasped in front of her. After a long moment, she spoke, her voice soft and low, so only he and those closest could hear. "That was the most beautiful thing I have ever heard," she said, her voice thick with her own unshed tears. She paused, then added the words that unlocked everything. "She must have been very special." The CEO flinched, not from the words, but from the gentle accuracy of them. He slowly turned his head to look up at her. He expected to see pity or discomfort, or professional curiosity, but he saw none of that. He saw only empathy in her eyes, a deep, understanding compassion that saw past the CEO, past the breakdown, and straight to the heart of his pain. She wasn't looking at a broken boss. She was looking at a grieving man, and in that moment, he felt a shift inside him. The shame and the embarrassment began to recede, replaced by a grudging, aching sense of relief. He took a shaky breath, the first one that didn't feel like it was catching in his throat. He looked past the director of operations and let his gaze drift over the faces of his team. He saw the young intern, her own face streaked with tears, her expression a mixture of horror and profound sorrow. He saw the sales guy looking down at his shoes, his usual cocky confidence completely gone. He saw the marketing director, his arms crossed, his face a mask of stunned reverence. They weren't judging him. They were with him. They had just walked through the darkest valley of his soul with him. They hadn't run away. He found his voice, though it came out as a rough, broken whisper. "She was," he said, his eyes still on the intern. "She was everything." He looked back at the piano, his hand tracing the edge of the keyboard. This was her piano. "I sold it after she was gone. I thought if I got rid of the things, I could get rid of the memories. I was wrong." He let out a short, humorless laugh. Clearly, he looked at the intern again, and this time, his gaze was gentle. "You didn't know," he said, answering the question he could see in her terrified eyes. "It's okay. It's more than okay." A small, fragile smile touched his lips. "She would have loved that you asked. She always wanted the world to hear her piano sing again." In that moment, the invisible wall between the executive suite and the front line didn't just crumble. It vaporized. The CEO, the titan, the enigma, was gone. In his place was a man who had just shared the most painful part of himself, and in doing so, had forged a connection with his employees that was more real and more powerful than any team-building exercise could ever create. The air in the room seemed to clear, the heavy awkwardness replaced by a new, shared understanding. People started to move again, slowly, quietly. Someone handed him a clean handkerchief. Another person quietly began to tidy up the empty glasses, giving him space. He took a sip of the water the director of operations had left for him. It was cool and clean, and it felt like the first real thing he had tasted in years. He looked at the piano one last time. The ghost was still there, but it wasn't a haunting presence anymore. It was a memory, warm and bittersweet. He had faced it, and he had survived. He felt a lightness in his chest that he hadn't felt in a decade, a loosening of a knot he hadn't even known he could untie. He had come to the offsite as a leader, but he was leaving it as something more. He was leaving it as a part of a human family, bound together not by a corporate mission statement, but by a few minutes of beautiful, heartbreaking music and the quiet, powerful truth of a shared tear.